Okay, whenever you're ready, Juanita.
Thank you. Good morning. I would like to call to order the special meeting for the Governance and Nominations Committee. Can you please take the roll call?
Certainly. Chair James,
Present.
Regent Bloom,
Present.
Regent Porth.
Present.
All committee members are present. You have a quorum, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. I would now like to call for an adoption of the agenda, which was sent to us via email from Karen, I believe. So do I have a motion to approve the agenda for today's meeting?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, the next item on the agenda is we have a draft of the minutes from our meeting of June 6th. And we had a revised draft sent to us this morning. I'm hoping that people had an opportunity to take a look at those, and perhaps we should just take a moment to review them and see if there are any questions, amendments, and any discussion before we take a motion to approve those minutes. Has everyone had an opportunity to review them?
Yes.
Are there any questions, comments, or changes, amendments?
Looks fine to me.
Yep.
Ira?
Come up fine. Yep.
Okay. If that's the case, I would like a motion to approve the minutes of the June 6th meeting.
So moved.
Second.
In favor? Aye.
Aye.
Okay. The next agenda item is further discussion of the policy review and approval processes, which we began that discussion at the June 6th meeting. And we needed time to have further review and to ask questions. So with that, I'd like to open the discussion of those items. Do we need to have Cameron do a recap? How are you feeling about that? Rick, Ira, would you like him to do a brief recap in terms of this item?
Can we,
Because-
can we
yeah.
share the screen with the eye? Can we put the
Oh,
item
yeah.
on the screen, please?
Do I have access to do that, or?
I think I can make you a co-host.
I have them up. Let me see if I can share my screen here.
Yeah, because there were 3 different documents, right?
You are listed as a presenter, Cameron, so you should be fine.
Okay, great. Can you see the two? So there's 2 substantive documents, and then the third was kind of an overview document. So I have the 2 substantive ones up here. On the left side of my screen is the policy. On the right is a draft of the procedures that are related to the policy.
Got it.
Yeah. Yep.
If it's too small, you can increase the size. You'll see above the document is a little 100%. You can plus or minus that if you need to see it a little more clearly.
Juanita, to try to help us today on this discussion, I just want to say that my question the last time we met was not a good one. I asked about whether this process should somehow go through the governance committee. And I think the policy that's defined in these documents we're looking at now works just fine. We may, from time to time, want to have want to get more input, but I think this policy as drafted allows for that and is the best way for us to address this. So I'm fine with what we have.
Yeah, and I think one of the purposes of this is for us to get a little bit better understanding of policies versus procedures,
Yep.
who's involved in creating policy. And I would like for this to be, the highlights and the summary to be presented at the board meeting. I think we should talk about how to convey this information, because I do believe that some of these things get lost when they just are part of the consent agenda. And then we ask people to approve the consent agenda, but I don't think that they fully understand what we're approving. And for this document, I actually, Cameron, would appreciate if we could do and it doesn't have to be a PowerPoint slide presentation, but if we could do a walkthrough in terms of what this document is, so that we don't have the same potential misunderstanding of so what is it trying to accomplish? Why are we doing it? And sort of the highlights of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to pull together a PowerPoint as well.
Okay. Ira and Rick, do you agree that that would be helpful? Do you think it's
Yeah.
something that the regents might find not worthy of the time of a busy agenda? So,
I really agree with Juanita with that. I think that's part of our role as the governance committee, is to try to get our colleagues to be thinking about these kinds of issues as they do their regular business, as they take care of their responsibilities.
you agree,
The,
Ira? Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, I was saying, go ahead, Ira.
No, I was going to say, I think it's important that, I think what Rick says is very important. We need to have, I think our colleagues need to have a clear notion of how policy, what quote policy means, and how it evolves. The item that I was concerned about the last time is presumably anyone can come in with a policy proposal, right?
Correct.
Okay. Under this policy, I invent a policy that I think should be adopted by the board. Okay.
Mhm.
And assume that it has to do with academic affairs, or academic and student affairs. Let's say we need a new policy because of what demonstrations on the camp, or we want to revise the policy or whatever because of, okay. And Juanita, Rick, and I say at an ASA meeting, okay, which we have done more than once, we need a clearer policy on this subject. Okay. But we're not necessarily the ones who are going to draft the policy. Okay. And what happens with that? In other words, the policy on student discipline, and when it comes to encampments on a campus is not clear. This is a hypothetical.
So
Okay.
Ira, I want to make sure that I understand this. So let me take a stab at answering your question, and then Cameron, you can correct me if I've missed something.
Mhm.
So if that comes up at a committee, first of all, we need to understand who the policy owner would be. Somebody has to be the policy owner, or the person to draft the policy. And I would imagine that there is some either expertise, substantive knowledge of the person who's going to be asked to draft the policy. But once they've done that, they have to then present it to a policy committee. And the policy committee is the one that's governing what the procedures are. They're going to develop templates for how you write policy language and guidelines. And so that's really the job of this, this policy committee, which is pretty extensive in terms of it being institutionally wide. It consists of the chief compliance officers of the within the system office. So that would be Cameron and his team, the chancellor, the executive vice chancellors, and then the presidents of the different colleges. So once they've kind of made sure that the policy meets all of the requirements and the framework and templates, they would then they would also talk about which board of regents committee this policy should be submitted to. So in your case, it would be the academic and student affairs committee.
This is the point that I was concerned about. This makes our committee, in a sense, like the House Ways and Means Committee, through which all budget items have to pass. It seems to me that the initial draft of the policy, right, would come presumably from Cameron and from the staff and the system office, let's say that handles student affairs. Okay. And that they would be responsible for the initial draft. Okay, I think the presidents come later. That I think these policy like that should go through the Council of Presidents, whatever we call that group. Okay, but first I would think it would go through the student affairs leads. So I think the president should be further along in the process. After there is a draft that's been reviewed by the system staff. Okay. And then it's routed to whatever college group, in this case, let's say the Council of Deans of Students or whatever student affairs officers for their comment. Okay, and then it would go to the Council of Presidents when it's further along, and to see what the president's reactions are. And if it survives all of that, or whatever way altered it survives all that, it would go to the appropriate board committee or committees.
Well, I think that it's accounted for, Ira, from the standpoint, if you look at definitions, they talk about who the assigned staff is and what the constituent unit is. And that constituent unit allows for the appropriate regents committee and to have input into that. So I think that this basically says that.
Yeah, and if I may,
Go ahead,
just
Cameron.
offer
Yeah.
some clarity. So if you're looking at the left documents of the policy establishes the required reviews, and it is a cascading review exactly as you described. So it starts with policy owners. So to go back to your hypothetical, if you were to request of your assigned staff in the ASA committee, I want an update to this policy, or I want this new policy. Whoever you made that request of, whatever institutional staff member you made that request of, their first step would be to identify, am I the policy owner, or do I need to find the policy owner? Who should be involved in this drafting process? Right. So they would find whatever, we've had policies that come from individuals. We've had them that come from, committees and working groups and things of those natures that are written as a group. But that would be the first step for that individual you're making this request of. After they have the policy drafted, is when they
would look at past policies in this area, presumably, right? What existing policy is.
Yeah. So however people are engaging in their drafting, that initial drafting process, we don't want to prescribe that, because we want it to be able to come to this initial phase as it comes in, right? Somebody has an idea, they may not even know how to write a policy. They may say, I've recognized this policy gap, and it's a sentence. they can engage with the policy committee at that point for drafting help as well. But they can also come with a fully fleshed policy that's,
They could come, but even if I came with a full draft, that draft has to go through the review process.
Oh,
That's
yes.
not going to go on. In other words, that's it should go through
Yeah.
the system staff who have, who play a role in this, the
Yep, so-
stakeholders and the stakeholders, if you will.
Yes, exactly. So then we can go over to the process side here, and this is where it really lays out the tiered approach. And so this is the order of reviews. We have the policy owners. Their review is often happening during the drafting phase, but if we have additional owners, at other institutions who weren't involved at the initial drafting, they would get the first pass. I would call that, a technical review and edit to make sure that the policy accomplishes the goals that they're looking to accomplish. From there, we go to stakeholder review. So stakeholders are individuals who are impacted by this policy change. Stakeholders are identified by the designees on the policy committee for their institution. So when we see it in the policy committee, we say, hey, this person needs to see it, this group needs to see it, and then that's how that group is defined. The stakeholder review also requires 3 required reviews, which is the general counsel's office, compliance, and then CFOs to analyze whether or not there's a financial impact of the policy. After we've gone through all of that and everybody who is a technical stakeholder is comfortable with the substance of the policy, then it is submitted to executive leadership. And that is the chancellor and the institutional presidents for their final review to ensure that it is consistent with our strategic vision, right? So we have our technical requirements, we have our strategic requirements. After all of that is when we get to
the executive leadership would be the executive leadership in the system office, correct?
So it's essentially the president or the chancellor's cabinet. So it's the presidents and system office executives.
I think the difficulty. I think the president should come later. I think the president should come after the policy, and the group of presidents then should have. In other words, here's the draft.
But
Yeah, and this is the last step prior to submission. So the appropriate system office staff who are assigned to that area would be in the original ones, right? The policy owner. So, if you're talking about an academic one, Ainsley is going to be in that policy owner discussion. Yeah. So we're not holding anybody out until we get to the end. This is just the final catch-all for individuals who were not identified as owners or stakeholders for that executive strategic review. And it is truly the last internal step of a policy, because as you'll see in the procedures, the next step is supplying it to the assigned staff for the appropriate Board of Regents committee.
Yeah, and I think, Ira, it's very important to make sure, and what I like about the way they've done this, they are including the presidents early enough to understand what the impact is on their individual institutions. So I see this as having 2 phases, which is the initial concept where you bring in, the system office staff, the particular committee that would be, really responsible, but you don't get to the final stage without first going through some steps where you have some input from the institution so that you understand there's so many unintended consequences of, policy. So I feel that we shouldn't wait until the end. There are two stages of which you get the input so you understand the implications, and then refine and make sure that the policy does what it is intended to do, and then it still gets the sign off from the institution presidents. But I do think it's important for them to not wait until the end of the process.
But they are my point. They would be the policy affecting academic affairs would go to the provost council. In other words, the campuses have to be involved. But I think there's in other words, there's an earlier level of the campus. I mean, I would want the provosts, the group that we as a committee deal with are the provosts primarily at the academic affairs, right? They're the ones who come before the committee. I think that there has to be college input. That I very much agree with Juanita, but I think it should come from the first round. Should come from the people on the campus who deal with that subject.
That is correct, and that's what this does. The policy owners are the people who deal with it on the campuses. They're the ones who are going to ultimately be responsible for compliance with that. with that policy. So the first, that's why it is the first step in the review process is policy owners, right? We need that technical feedback early on.
Yeah, the
You know,
technical fee, yeah.
yeah, so that's really what that's designed to be. So that's the drafting, that's the technical feedback phase. That's all with the policy owners. The presidents don't usurp that authority from, their subject matter experts by any means. It starts with them, and it doesn't really get to the, presidential sign off or executive sign off until the end. One thing I will note is the policy committee is comprised of presidential designees, and so presidents have a heads up of what policies are being
Well,
considered, what's being
that's what I'm
worked on.
concerned about. Maybe they have a heads up.
Yeah, so that's why we asked for
I
presidential
mean, I
designees.
think we had an instance where not too long ago where the president says that they didn't have a heads up.
And that would have been before this process and procedure. Since we've been established this group, we've been very clear. We asked the presidents directly, do you want to participate yourself or would you like to provide a designee? They have self-identified the designee, and we have said the responsibility of that designee is to act as your designee, which means to share information with you and be able to act on your behalf in this context.
What I want to know is the chair of the ASA committee. Okay, when the president comes before us, okay, is that the provost council has reviewed it, and if it's a student affairs council, the council of student affairs officers has reviewed it as a body.
Yes, yes. So that would be the case. And you'll notice as you're getting these policies that have gone through this process, you've been receiving a list of who's been involved in the review, who was involved in the draft. So that's new, and that's a product of this process because we've been, working on this process, trying to figure out how best to engage people without slowing down the process too much. So that's what that list is a product of this process that you're here taking a look at today. Is why at the ASA committee last ASA committee last week, when you got to the student code, we were able to say it was reviewed by BPSAs, it was reviewed by the academic councils, it was reviewed by all of these people. That's a list you're going to be getting with policies. So you'll want to look for that, in the staff report or in some contextual documents that are provided to you, because that is a requirement. We want you to know and feel comfortable with the group that has reviewed this, that the right people were there and the right technical expertise were involved in the drafting process.
Now, I think you've answered the questions in terms of the level of input at various stages. So does that answer your question, Ira? I mean, I think that they've pretty thoroughly addressed.
I think there's a lot of this provides a lot of opportunity for input. I have no, but if you look at it as a railroad, okay, after everybody gets on the train, okay, and that's the input. The train has to make stops before it gets to the Board of Regents Committee. Okay, it makes those stops would be the councils, whatever, the finance directors, the student affairs people, the academic leadership on the campuses, depending on what the policy is, and then it comes to the board committee and the president's council. I want the presidents to have an opportunity as a group. I mean, not as individuals, but not as through their designees. I don't want them to be able to come in and say, we never heard about this.
Yeah, so
It
they
failed.
receive it. Sorry, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry.
I was gonna say they receive it as a group, so that the information sharing is with all the presidents at once. We send it out to the presidents, the relevant system office staff, and the chancellor all at one time, and they do engage, whether it be in the email or at the president's council. It's just the calendars don't always align for it to be at this meeting or that meeting, but we do share it as a group. They're able to offer their feedback and kind of play off each other's feedback in that final review phase.
So Ira, in the policy development procedures, it does talk about the review process, including the fact that it gets reviewed by this the policy committee, and the committee is the president's as well as the appropriate staff that are assigned to the committee. So
It's the presidents or their designees, if I
What-
read this correctly.
right.
The designees are the ones I'm worried about.
Yeah, but
Um,
I think that's frankly, I don't think that needs to be written into the policies or the procedures. I do believe that the responsibility and accountability for the presidents to know what the policies are is part of their role and responsibility. I don't think that the procedure should prescribe what the president's role is. If there's a policy and it affects their institution and they decide that they're going to designate it to someone else for the implementation or development and approval, they don't get to come to the meeting and say, well, we never heard about this before, because that means that they're not following they're not following the procedures that have been outlined, and they're not living up to their responsibility and accountability as institutional presidents. I don't think you can legislate that level of the appropriate engagement from the president.
Well, I think the way you do it is not being insulting of the presidents, but saying that the group of presidents has to approve the policy as a group, as a body.
And so there's one, so we definitely give it back to them, right? The executive review as the last stage. So they get it through their designees when it comes to the policy committee early on, right? That's when they understand this policy exists and it's being worked on. And then they get it again at the executive level. That is directly to them, not their designees. Why I refrain from mentioning anything of approval at the institution is because the Board of Regents is the sole approval authority.
Yes.
So we cannot have approvals throughout this. We have basically rights of input throughout this, but something getting to the Board of Regents, that is where the approval happens.
They don't have to approve it. But I'm not, I agree with that. I mean, because the board is the sole. But I would like to know, for example, if the president, endorsed this policy by a vote of 4-2. It's not a requirement, but it's an indication of, I mean, not only here, but in my former lives, there were a number of failures of presidents' designees to do what we expected them to do. And there were failures on the receiving end of the presidents to ask questions they should have asked.
Right. So Ira, when you look through the procedures and you get to the third, number 3, and I actually want the review process, and I do want to move on to the other agenda items.
Yeah, I don't want to. Yeah, I know I've been beating this horse for a while.
It's
I
clear in the
apologize.
procedures that after all of this, there is an executive leadership review, and that's after they've gotten the stakeholder feedback that's been incorporated, and then it's presented to the chancellor and the institutional presidents by the policy committee. So if the president has designated one of their designees for the policy committee, there still has a responsibility. They have a responsibility to review this, and that's what it says right before the paragraph where it talks about the Board of Regents review and approval. But it does have a paragraph very specifically indicating that there's an executive leadership review step in the process. I think what you're asking for, though, is you want a report back on what the vote was, but they're not the ones who vote on it. We are. But it does account for review by the presidents.
And if we were to receive significant feedback at that phase that we weren't able to rectify in terms of incorporating it into the policy before it's submitted to the committee, we would note that, right? So that you would understand if there's any controversy behind this. And that would be something that would come in the contextual documents with the policy. To date, we have not received any feedback that we were unable to incorporate from any of the executive leadership.
And my thought on this is, I'm not sure an up or down vote by the presidents before the Board of Regents has a chance to review the policy is in the best interest of the system. For sure, we need a thorough review with feedback and recommendations for revision if necessary, but not a formal up or down vote.
It's not a formal, I'm not, you're right, Rick. I agree with that. I don't mean a formal that they can reject it, but
Right.
a sense of the body vote is what I'm thinking about. Not a formal, I agree with you about that. They can't stop the policy. In other words,
Yeah.
But the same thing with the provost, a sense of the body.
Yeah. I would say
I'm going
I
to stop
think,
beating this horse because I think I don't know if I've had my say more than if that results in any change or not, but I appreciate everybody's patience with my, but this is a horse that's kicked me more than once in my past, in my past lives. So, for whatever it's worth.
respect that.
Understand. You'd like to get some insight in terms of what the backdrop is. I just don't know if you can write that into the process for the review. I mean,
Yeah, and my
the fact that there's an articulated paragraph that talks about executive leadership review and that they can provide final recommendations or modifications. I kind of think that that language is about as far as it can go in terms of being prescriptive language in defining a written policy.
honestly, I feel the same way.
I yield to my colleagues, who
And
I
then,
respect greatly.
and then if we get kicked by the horse, we'll come back and say, I
I'm
reviewed
going to
it,
come
right?
back and say, look at my rear
Told you
end.
so. You can say, I told you so.
I won't say that.
Absolutely.
I'll say, look at my rear end.
Okay. With that, can we have a motion to approve? This is a policy review and approval process that we would like to present to the Board of Regents as a report from and a recommendation from the GNC committee. And I would like a motion to approve that we will make this recommendation.
I'll make the motion.
I'll second it.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Now, there is another one about policies, rules, and regulations and laws that require confidentiality. Karen, did you want to take that up? There wasn't a specific written document about that one, but.
No, there is not. And we have been working on this. And as we go towards the board retreat, I think it's important to develop, and I think there has been in the past a board handbook, which would have some of this information in it that would be regularly updated as laws change. But I did want to give sort of a high level overview of some of the areas. And if there are other areas that you want to talk about in terms of, and I'm looking at this specifically from the board's role, not necessarily the entire system. So if what you are looking for is more the entire system view of what are confidential records, then that would be important to know as we put together the handbook. But some of the things that I think are essential for this discussion as one that most people are familiar with, which is known by its acronym as FERPA, which is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which protects everything but directory information with regard to our students, unless there's specific written permission by a student who's over the age of majority or their parent. To provide information or to disclose to the public information. There have been a couple of times where there were snafus with other state agencies because many of our students have employment with us and other things, and occasionally those records get out when they shouldn't because they are contained in other databases. So those are things that we look at very closely in terms of our ability to disclose that information, even for research purposes, under the state's aggregator law where they can take, where they want to see outcomes and where things go. So they want to see how many people are in the workforce, how many people have completed their degrees, what their earnings are like. There are agreements that we enter into that allow that information to be de-identified and utilized for research purposes with a specific, purpose only, and those purposes are fairly narrowly guarded with regard to that. We all are familiar with the Freedom of Information Act, which provides exemptions for records that are otherwise widely public records. Those are usually those where the employee has a reasonable expectation of privacy in those records. Medical records, FMLA, leave type records, certain records with regard to disabilities, or even, and when it comes to, and I've had this debate directly with the Freedom of Information Commission myself, as identity theft has become much easier. We have in the past made the argument that employees' home addresses and dates of birth should not be readily provided, because they are two of the things that are necessary that make it much easier to engage in identity theft. I lost that argument with the FOI Commission. So those, unless the employee takes steps themselves to guard that information is generally available to the public. And the reasonable expectation of privacy is a reasonable person rule. It would be the reasonable person, not the individual. If we are required to do a review of those records, independent of the employee, to determine whether or not we believe that a reasonable person would find these records to be personal or private. And once we've made that review, if we think that's the case, then we give the employee the opportunity to object to the disclosure of those records. Otherwise, those records go out and we notify the employee that we have made this assessment and those records will be disclosed. My office is finalizing an updated FOI handbook, which also will be made available to the board members, and for which we will conduct training on that issue. Along with that is a separate statute, but is the FOI says, except as otherwise provided by state or federal law. So its exemptions or records that are covered are much wider than that. Sorry about the hair blowing around. My window is open because it's warm in here today. The much broader than just the exemptions that are contained within the FOI itself. For example, our police officers would have their home addresses protected because they're police officers, unlike other public employees, and we are obligated to follow that law, even though that exemption is not specifically within the FOIA. Evaluations of professional employees in a system of higher ed are exempt records. That includes annual evaluations, it includes student evaluations, it includes 360s that you might do on your professional staff or your leaders. All of those records are not disclosable under Connecticut state law, outside of but recognized by FOIA. Connecticut also has a separate law in addition to FERPA that protects student records that have been provided to us by high schools, public secondary schools, as well as other independent institutions of higher education. So the records that we gather as we admit students or have transfer students, oops, did we just lose somebody? I think we lost Jessica, are not disclosable by us. We have to protect those records as if we were the institution that they were coming from. And then student visa status is not something that is public information. So we are not required to disclose students' visa status or the type of visa that they have. Lately we have gotten a number of questions with regard to that, particularly as it relates to the issue with regard to admitting Chinese students how many do we have, what campuses are they on, what visas are they on. We will not be responding in any detailed way to those questions. So those are just some of the ones that I think are more the ones that you will deal with as the Board of Regents. That is not an exhaustive list, but I did want to give an overview so that I could get some feedback from the members in terms of other areas that you are specifically looking for that may not be, that may affect us day to day in our work as employees, but may not be something that the board would deal with directly. So as we move forward towards the board retreat and putting together these materials, I would welcome any feedback on the breadth of the list that you're looking for.
Okay. I know, Karen, that we had an incident at one of our foundations a few years ago where I believe we were, I don't know, corrected, reprimanded, or pointed out that one of the practices that was happening at one of the institution foundations was that the donors were very involved. The scholarship fund donors were very involved in the selection of which students should be awarded scholarships and their guidelines. And I think we had to correct some of those practices because we were providing more information than we were supposed to provide, or giving access to some of these donors to information that they wanted so that they could choose which students they wanted to give scholarships to.
Okay.
And that was not really within the guidelines of these protections and confidentiality. So, and it was quite the battle because
I'm sure it was.
it was quite the battle because apparently that foundation had been quite successfully doing that and working and building up their scholarship fund and their donor participation for quite a while, and we had to change the rules, and it was a challenging situation.
Yes, we are in the process right now, and thank you. I will add that to the list because the donors, UConn successfully defended a case that where they were requesting a list of donors and even ticket holders to our various institutions because that's confidential information because it's a marketing, it's marketing and people can go after our donors or our clients and attempt to pull them away. But UConn very successfully was able to defend against an FOI request for those types of records. So the donor records are not public information unless obviously the board approved naming rights at your last board meeting. So clearly the donors in those cases are identified, not the amounts necessarily that they donated in order to achieve that, but certainly that they had donated money and that as a result, we were honoring them with a naming rights to the institution. I also left off Title IX, which we have our expert with us. If there are any questions about the confidentiality around records related to Title IX investigations and complaints. And those are most, the sexual assault or sexual violence records are the ones that are most that people think of as confidential in that process. So that's another important one to point out. But yes, the FERPA, and we are in the process of updating and standardizing our operating agreements with the foundations. We are working with Southern's foundation right now on revising that operating agreement, and we want to make it a template across the board to utilize with the other foundations. And that's something that we typically address in those operational agreements.
Okay.
But we're finding that many of the operational agreements have not been updated. We found one that has not been updated since 1999. So that might be a little behind the times.
Yeah, I think you'll continue to find more things like that. So I gather all of this will be then incorporated into some kind of a board manual, as well as the onboard training for new regents, which hopefully we can have a refresher for the current regents, some of whom may never have had any kind of onboarding, formal onboarding that, so, more to come, but necessary so that we don't shoot ourselves in the foot.
Yes.
So,
And this would also be part of the onboarding of our new presidents as well, in terms of, areas of Connecticut law that they may not be familiar with if they're coming from, another state
got it.
and another institution.
Do we have, going back to policies, do we have a policy that says that the bylaws or whatever, the operating rules for individual campus foundations have to be filed the, with the system office?
That is not with the system office, but there is a provision for the board to approve bylaw changes
Yeah,
and those types of things. I'm not sure about the operating agreements as much as it is their bylaws. I'm not sure that again, I'm finding that wasn't necessarily occurring on a regular basis. And we are dealing with a situation now that I could update you on in executive session at another meeting, so that it's appropriately noticed, where the statute, which so the records of the foundations that are related to the institutions here are the records of the institutions themselves. And so should the foundation dissolve, or should they become or dissolve themselves, those records become the records of
Of the
the
institute.
institutions, and the board has a role in determining what happens to the assets of that foundation.
okay. I think that's important to
Mhm.
have that. I have two other questions. I'm sorry to be the cause of, if a campus, if a foundation says now, given, all the things that have happened in the last year and a half or 2 years, our donor wants to create a scholarship for young female students aspiring to be young female students of color aspiring to be lawyers.
Mhm.
Okay. How's that, how is that dealt with in light of what's been, what the Supreme Court, what's been going on? I mean, who approves those individual gifts? And if there's a gift that potentially problematic for one reason or another.
Yeah. So I'm going to answer that in sort of three buckets, Regent Bloom. In some cases, we have endowments or scholarships or funding that go back many, many years, and
Yes,
for which there is no
that's
living
yeah.
donor. And so there is a process to change the purpose of that donation, largely in keeping with the donor's intent, but it is a more of a complicated process to do that when the donor is no longer alive. For those that were already established before these rules were and the views of the courts in terms of what you can and cannot do have changed, is the most, the easiest route to do that is to talk to the donor about changing the purpose of, or the categories of students who are eligible for that scholarship, to make it compliant. The other way in which this can be dealt with, and it's called pooling and awarding. I'm not sure if I'm going to get that exactly right, but you look at the students who are applying for scholarship aid as a class as a whole, putting aside other than the dollar amounts that you have to award, and you decide who you're going to award scholarships to out of the pool of money that you have available to you. So the decisions are made without respect to, it has to be a woman of color studying law. And then once the decisions are made that we have the six of you, we're going to award 6 scholarships, we then match the available money and scholarships to the individual students. And then the award has been made on a blind status other than need. And it may just happen to line up with a woman of color who is studying law because there's funding available that is most suitable to that particular student. But you've made the decision that that student will be awarded a scholarship equally with the other people who are competing for those scholarship dollars. So that's sort of the three ways in which these things are handled.
And do we advise the donors, assuming that they're still with us, that we have pool? I mean, what if the donor says, this is what I'm really passionate about?
If they're passionate about that, then we try to meet the intent of the donors. But at the same time, for instance, I'm aware of one of our campuses where the intent of the donor is so specific that there are years in which the money goes unawarded because they don't have, I'll give a bizarre example. They don't
Right.
have somebody with
Right.
3 arms who
Yeah.
wants to study,
Yeah.
astronomy.
Right.
And so the money goes unawarded. And so the conversation should be with the donor, is this what you really intend, is that the money doesn't get utilized for any students who may want to study astronomy because they can't meet the first part of that. And usually you're able to bring the donor around and, to that point of view, and to also understand that it doesn't mean that it won't go to the purpose for which you intended, or it won't go. These students are going to get scholarship money because we've determined that they're entitled to scholarship money. It may not just be your money.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, that's, and I have one final question, and I apologize to my colleagues because I think Rick and Juanita, they think they're tired of hearing from me this morning. Going back to the student identification, international students, we do identify, or don't, in other words, they have particular visas, particular designations. When we protect, in other words, how many students have this type of visa to study in the United States? Who are they? If we got a question like that.
We would not, if it was a press question or a non, in other words, if it wasn't one of our oversight bodies like the federal government, asking, how many, have we exceeded our visa allotment, or have we appropriately awarded the visas? Somebody that has a role in determining whether or not we have followed the law or in compliance with the law in what we need to do to host an international student, or enroll in an international student. Those obviously we would answer because there are regulatory agencies that we have responsibilities to. But if the Hartford Courant calls up and says, I want to know how many students of Chinese descent that you have at Central Connecticut State University, and what type of visa are they on, and what is their course of study, we would not provide that information unless we could do it in such a large way to aggregate the information that the students themselves are not identifiable. And that's very difficult. We don't have a large number of students. And so we would probably say that we have X number of international students, and they break down in the following categories by percentage without any further information provided. Because we do often, it's a way we recruit, is to say, we've accepted students from the following countries.
Yes.
But we don't give specific information about what type of visa, what they're studying, all the things that are normal information that wouldn't be disclosed about our students.
I mean, one of the things we see in some of the ASA proposals is, because one of the things we ask is, are the students, this wonderful program in pottery in pottery design, where would they come from? And sometimes the answer is, international students are interested in pottery design and will come, will come here because we have this program.
Mm-hmm.
And then, we could get an inquiry from a legislator saying, we've heard that, in pottery design, is all occupied by international students. Why are we doing? I mean, this is the kind of thing that seems to be happening now.
And I think we would say is that we admit students to those classes in the same way we admit all of our students to classes. Often it's a first come, first served basis. How many of us when we were in college had to go to ad drop because we couldn't get the course at the time that we wanted, or in the sequence that we needed. And that occurs, and then we would probably have a conversation with the college to say, how many, what kind of a demand is this? Is there a way to open a second section so that we don't have complaints from students that they can't get in? But sometimes, particularly in something like computer science, if you're looking for a particular skill set and you can't find a faculty member with that skill set, the ability to take that course is going to be limited until we can identify the appropriate faculty member to deliver the course.
Yes, yeah.
So Ira, thank you. Don't feel bad about asking these questions, because in today's times, we do need to understand what some of the implications are as far as policies and how they are affecting our students or potentially. So thank you for those questions, and thank you, Karen, for your update. I would just like to remind you that in the pre-read materials is the actual item that we're going to be recommending, the formal proposal of the adoption of the policy on policies, as well as the process for establishing board policy. So that's already in, that summary is already, and the recommendation is already in your pre-read materials. That will be included in the report to the board in June. So what I would like to say before I call for a motion to move to executive session, the members of the Governance and Nominations Committee will move to executive session in accordance with 1-200 subsection 6A and 1-210 B1 of the general statutes for the purposes of discussing the potential recommendation of an appointment of an individual to serve on the Board of Regents, and for the purpose of discussing a preliminary draft document. No votes will be taken in executive session. Additionally, there may be a vote of the committee following executive session. Jessica Paquette, Adam Joseph, and Karen Buffkin will be invited into executive session for the second item, as they have testimony or opinion that is pertinent to that matter and will be in attendance during the discussion of that item. Therefore, please allow me to call for a motion to move to executive session for the purpose as I have described them above. May I have a motion?
So moved.
I'll
Is there a
second.
second? Thank you.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. And now we should pause the live streaming.
Okay, please hold.
Okay. And Jessica is back. We are
Just
here.
a sec, hold on. Okay, we have stopped the live stream.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Ben.
you.